Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. Crime, it did a number on New York and much of the rest of the country in the 1970s, and again in the crack epidemic of the 1980s and early 90s. Now violent crime, specifically homicide, is surging again. Why? And what do we need to do to avoid a repeat of the terrible, tragic days of the past? I'll ask my guest, who's had a long and successful career dealing with these very difficult issues. He's Zachary Carter, a former U.S. attorney and former judge who has also served as New York City's Corporation Counsel, its top lawyer. Mr. Carter does not play favorites. He has prosecuted hardened criminals and bad cops as well, including the officers who savagely attacked Abner Louima back in 1997. Judge Carter, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to get your thoughts on the current surge in homicides that we're seeing. The homicide rates in big cities went up 30% last year when we were in the pandemic, and they've gone up 24% so far this year. And I might point out that nearly all of those homicides were from shootings. It was a case of gun violence. Why do you think we're seeing these substantial increases?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is to place this in context. We've had a remarkable run of low crime statistics for a very long time. And we've had this at the same time. We have been encouraging police to police less aggressively. At a time when the city, in part because of litigation, was forced to abandon practices that were that abused the right to stop and frisk, and because the new administration embraced a policy of drastically reducing the number of encounters between police and public as a result of stop and frisk. The stops were reduced from a high of in the high 600,000s of mostly black and brown young men to closer to 10,000, which closely correlates with an appropriate use of stop and frisk, a constitutional use of stop and frisk, than kind of randomized stops that were more likely a product of stopping people in the hundreds of thousands each year. And as those stops drastically decreased, the trend of reduction in crime continued in a positive way. And so when you look at where we were before the pandemic struck, we were still doing incredibly well. And New York City was doing better than most cities around the country, but most large cities were doing well in terms of serious violent crime. And so we have to look at this, in my view, as aberrational, but it's aberrational across the country. And so when we look at we're trying to find groping for the causes of this, I think that we have to ask ourselves what has happened recently. And I think that the pandemic occasioned a perfect storm of events. First of all, the police departments were distracted. They have to police an environment in which movement is restricted, in which there are curfews. So police they're dealing with medical emergencies. Right. So police resources are spread thin. But also, what happened during the pandemic was attention to the George Floyd homicide and the protests surrounding that, and the political debate surrounding that that directly affected police. And I think that it's fair to say that one response from rank and file police officers, frankly, aided and abetted by collective bargaining units for police officers around the country, was to discourage police officers from taking the kind of actions that are necessary to suppress crime, to prevent crime. I think that there was a sense that if we're not permitted to police the way we've always policed, in a way that I think many of us would consider overly aggressive and not constructive, if we can't do it our way, then we're not going to do it.
We're going to go to the opposite extreme.
Correct. And so my sense is that some of the assertive and proactive policing that is necessary to keep us safe has not been happening as much. And there's a difference between being proactive and being overly aggressive. When you're being proactive, you're paying attention to what the statistics tell you about where crime is occurring, under what circumstances crime is occurring, and what buttons you can push, what levers you can pull in order to address that that stubborn minority of actors who account disproportionately for a large proportion of dangerous criminal activity.
I could add one more thing. Police departments across the country were also dealing with the effects of COVID within the department. You have police officers
Correct.
who contracted the coronavirus. And so in addition to the additional stresses that you've mentioned, they've also had some manpower and illness issues.
Correct.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about police behavior, police misbehavior, and how some things may have changed over a number of decades, of which I was around to see them all. Let's take two celebrated, infamous cases. One was the Rodney King and George Floyd. Both of those cases were videotaped, and there was no ambiguity about what viewers saw when they looked at those tapes. And yet the officers in the Rodney King case, which is back in the early 90s in Los Angeles, they were acquitted. And that led, of course, to the Los Angeles riots, in which dozens of people were killed. And then fast forward to the George Floyd case, and Derek Chauvin, the police officer in that case, was tried and convicted of murder and sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison. Two radically different outcomes. What do you think contributed to the difference in those cases, and were those differences significant, or would you consider the George Floyd case to be simply a one-off?
Well, I think that one significant difference between the two cases is that while both of the incidents were videotaped, only one of the trials was broadcast to the public. We had a chance to both witness the death of George Floyd, but also to watch gavel-to-gavel coverage of the trial itself, and that is, I think, a critical difference. I think that the presence of the public at that trial, first of all, I think it has an effect on the actors. Everybody brings their A game. And I think that there's an awareness on the part of all of the actors that they're being watched, that they're being held accountable.
Excuse me. That's interesting, because you're talking now not just about prosecutors, but defense lawyers, the judge, anyone who's involved in this trial. They're aware that the eyes of the nation and actually much of the world were on this trial.
Correct. That is correct.
Right. So you think that would have had an effect, and you had mentioned you've already mentioned the protests that followed the death of George Floyd. Were you surprised by the intensity, by the scope of those protests?
I was pleasantly surprised about the diversity of the participants in those protests. I think that because of videotape, because this was an incident in which most people believe that what they saw was unambiguous in terms of what was done to George Floyd and the kind of recklessness and depravity with which it was done, the indifference to his suffering. I think that touched everyone on a very human level, without regard to race or class, and so it brought out people young and old, white, black, brown. It was an impressive showing of support for the notion that police should not be abusing their authority, particularly when it comes to engagement with communities of color.
Now, you've dealt with the criminal justice system for so much of your adult life, which means that you've seen so much. When you look at the savagery of some of these cases, the Rodney King case, the George Floyd case, I mentioned the case that you prosecuted in the introduction, the Abner Louima case, where the man was tortured. He was not killed, but he was really tortured in an awful way. Do you have any thoughts or insights about where this savagery comes from? What causes this kind of extreme behavior on the parts of some people in law enforcement?
Well, it's hard to account for the singular depravity that happens in a case like Abner Louima, where someone is anally sodomized with a broken broomstick.
Right.
It takes a different kind of human being, cop or not, to do something of that sort. It takes, in my view, a different kind of person to casually keep their knee on the neck of someone who is gasping for breath, where you have people around them pleading for the police officer to show some humanity and to be indifferent to those. So I think both of those cases, to some extent, are aberrations. But I noticed that most of the cases that you mentioned do not involve the use of firearms.
Right.
And I have always believed that those cases, the cases of involve shootings and cases that involve beatings and other uses of force without firearms, are motivated by different things. In my experience, shootings are almost always a fear response.
Mm-hmm.
Beatings are an anger response, which is why at the Department of Justice, beating cases are nicknamed summary punishment cases. All right, where officers, against all training and professionalism, respond with anger and a use of excessive force, that is a response to their anger, as opposed to using whatever limited force is necessary to bring a situation under control.
The race hovers over nearly every aspect of American life. It's actually been astonishing to me growing up and seeing the degree to which it continues to permeate our lives, and no sign that that's going to let up at all. When you think of the criminal justice system, Uh, what are the issues that bother you most, or that you think of as most important when you think about the role of race and policing and incarceration and that sort of thing?
I think that we have always struggled to find a way to help police officers understand that we are all afflicted with subconscious biases. All of us who grow up in this society, all of us who grow up with media messages that are embedded with racial and gender stereotypes, that none of us are immune from that. And that very often we're not necessarily accusing an officer who's acted in response to those cues as being racist. We're just accusing them of being human because we're all afflicted by it. And sometimes I think we have to find ways to help officers understand that we're not accusing them, we're just bringing to their attention the attitudes that exist in all of us that we have to try to suppress in the interest of treating people with dignity and fairness. And sometimes I think it requires us to be generous about sharing incidents in our own lives where we may have had those issues. I mean, I was a criminal court judge at the height of the crack epidemic, sitting in criminal court in Queens. And I remember one Friday evening, I must have had 100 cases on my calendar, most of them drug cases, a lot of them involving young Black and Latino young men. And during that time, and it continues to the day, many of them dress like their favorite hip hop stars, right? You know, with the baggy jeans and the hoodies and the like, and or caps worn backwards. And I remember presiding over a session in which I saw a lot of these kids, and then leaving the courthouse late at night, and going to my car and seeing some kids in front of the courthouse on the street, and thinking to myself, "Yep, well, there goes some of my defendants or their friends."
Right.
And then I got into my car and I drove up to a reunion event at Cornell University. And I got there, and the Saturday afternoon that I arrived, there was a picnic for the Black Cornell Black Alumni Association, and all of my friends had their teenage kids there, and they were dressed exactly the same way.
Yeah.
Really good kids doing really well in whatever schools they were in. They were just dressed. That's the way they dressed. And they weren't a threat to anybody. They were not engaged in criminal activity. And I felt so ashamed at how I had judged those kids outside the courthouse the evening before. And I consider myself something of a champion of civil rights. And if I can have those attitudes, you know that rank and file cops can have those attitudes.
Right.
And so it's a matter of calling that to the attention of these cops and saying, you can't act on that.
It's really interesting to make this point about all of us having some of these subconscious biases, and by definition, the fact that they're subconscious means that you don't recognize them, or they're difficult
Right.
to recognize, which makes them difficult to correct. The defund the police as a slogan, it was a slogan that I thought really hurt Democrats politically. To some extent, the Republicans are still trying to make hay on that slogan. It was basically a gift from the gods for the other side. On the other hand, when you hear an explanation of the phrase, there are some points that the people using that terminology are trying to make. What are the thoughts you have when you hear that phrase, and how do you feel about it?
Well, listen, I never took it literally. When people are engaged in activism around an issue that arouses passion, there's always going to be hyperbole that lends itself to misunderstanding. But I think that, frankly, most people of good faith should have understood that no one intended that phrase to be taken literally. It didn't mean defund the police. It meant let's reevaluate what we are funding for the police for. Are we funding police for what they do well or what they don't do so well? Are there other entities? Are there social workers? Are there other emergency services people who specialize, for instance, in dealing with the mentally ill, who should be getting increased funding? And quite frankly, are there things for which police officers should have their funding increased so that they can double down on the things that they do well? Should we be increasing funding to train folks for police officers for the fact that inevitably they're going to encounter mentally ill people, and there won't always be the time to get specialists on the scene to deal with them optimally. So I think that people of good faith understand that the term defunding really is it represents a bundle of ideas around reevaluating how we use policing and whether or not there are ways of redeploying them differently or better, or are there other entities that we need to increase funding for in order to deal with our public safety problem?
At the time of this taping, we've just gone through the voting process for mayor of New York. It's complicated this time around because we have this ranked choice voting system. But in the initial returns, Eric Adams has a substantial lead. He's a former police officer, he's borough president of Brooklyn. He made crime and public safety a cornerstone of his campaign. If he goes on to win, or even the fact that he's substantially ahead right now, what do you think that tells us about the state of things right now in New York City and perhaps beyond the 5 boroughs as well?
Well, it is interesting that voter choices so easily turns on the issue of the moment. You know, as we discussed earlier in this interview, before the onset of the pandemic, we were doing well in terms of being in control of our crime issues. You know, we had a long-term, a decade-long at least, reduction in crime year over year over year, particularly under this last administration in the city of New York. And so the fact that voters are responding to this, what I would like to think, this momentary crisis is interesting. There are other issues that I think that needed to be taken into account aside from public safety, and that in fact, when you take the longer view, would contribute to increasing public safety in the long run. To the extent that we have at least one candidate who talked about, and who was regarded as the progressive in the race, Maya Wiley, who talks about a bottom-up look at our social justice system, paying attention to the people who are least advantaged among us, and as a way of dealing with issues that impact on public safety for a change from a bottom-up approach rather than some form of trickle down. I think it's unfortunate that we may be missing that opportunity, but it is what it is.
We've run out of time, so I guess we're going to have to leave it there. Zachary Carter, I thank you so much for joining us and talking with us about these very important issues. For those who have been watching, thanks for doing so, and I'll see you next time.